is good for everyone else around us. So we just joined Twitter Live, YouTube Live, and Facebook Live. So we'll get this show on the road. And please do participate in the discussion. This is a really important topic. And I know that you have experiences, you and the audience have experiences that you can share and that can help to drive the conversation. Welcome to the Nonprofit Report, your update on nonprofit organizations, issues, and leaders. I'm your host, Mark Oppenheim, and today we're discussing the important topic of suicide prevention, particularly pertaining to our high school and college students. And we'll share some important resources that could save lives. Our special guests today are Kelly Davis, Vice President of Youth and Peer Advocacy of the Mental Health America in Virginia, René Piñero, Vice President of Behavioral Health and Clinical Operations of Mental Health Association of Massachusetts, and John Orr, the Vice President of Programs for Vibrant Emotional Health in New York. So we've got the United States well represented by you all. And a reminder to Zoom attendees that we take 3 snap polls during the show, and we'll announce results, and questions submitted through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen will be included in our discussion. So thank you so much for joining. I'm going to go quickly to you, Kelly, but just sort of to set you up. Suicidal thoughts are really common among teens and young adults, particularly among teens and young adults who are grappling with all sorts of different issues, right? Coming into adulthood, identity, dealing with this real change, the whole anxiety of being an adult. 11% of young adults report serious thoughts of suicide, and between 1% and 2% report an attempt. So these numbers are actually higher. Just if we focus on high school students, with nearly 20% reporting serious suicidal thoughts. So this is a real issue. I mean, if we're talking about 20%, what that means is that when we walk into any high school and we walk through those corridors, we are passing people who have very, very serious suicidal thoughts. Isn't that the case, Kelly?
Yeah, it is pretty astounding for a topic that we often don't talk about. During 2020, right, there'd been a decade of increases in depression, suicide attempts, suicidal thoughts among young people, and the pandemic obviously really escalated that. There was a survey that came out of the CDC that 1 in 4 young adults seriously considered suicide in 2020. So it's a really big problem, but it's often it can be hard to really talk about. I think people are afraid if they bring it up, they might put the idea in someone's head, which we know isn't true. And I think that there's a lot of shame or guilt, whether you lost someone to suicide, whether you've had a suicide attempt or thought about it, because of societal stigma and beliefs around what it means to struggle. That's why, I am a multiple suicide attempt survivor during my adolescence. And I think it's really important for us to have these conversations and for people to disclose their shared experience, because so many people are dealing with this profound issue and challenge in silence.
Well, let's talk about that issue of shame, René. If I have suicidal thoughts, if I've had suicidal thoughts, should I be ashamed of how my mind is bringing me into that place? Should I feel shame? And how do I deal with that first barrier to just sharing with someone else, René?
Yeah, absolutely not. You should never feel shame because of those thoughts and emotions that you're dealing at that moment. I think one of the most important things is to surround yourself with family, friends, and a community that is supportive and that is able to bring you to that environment when you can open up and talk about these things. Like Kelly mentioned, there's still a lot of stigma in regards to mental health, substance use disorders, and especially suicide. And it's very concerning because, like you mentioned, with statistics, a lot of cases are not reported. So you can definitely feel like there are way more cases than that, especially when we're talking about suicidal ideation, which not a lot of people talk about.
So let's talk about the origins of this, John. There are a lot of different ways in which people can get to that place. And René mentioned the whole issue of substance use disorder, and Kelly talked about a sense of isolation. Could you just sort of try to, for us all, give us a sense of how the different routes that people get to that very isolated, dark, and hopeless place?
Sure. Well, one of the things I think is really important to note about that is that a lot of times the responsibility is placed upon the individual, that they have ended up in this place of isolation, for due to some faults of their own, and it doesn't give credit to any of the societal issues that are coming up. And some of those can be, some of the disparities within the healthcare system, racism, discrimination. There are a lot of factors, that can contribute externally to an individual, feeling isolated, and that will lead us into then, considering what are someone's like individual risk factors. And I think about high school, I think about bullying, I think about the effects of peer influence. And some of the things that have come up for young people that we know now are there are just coordinated attacks. Bullying seems almost too light a word with the way that young people might share sexual images of another young person. And so that, there are a lot of social factors, that contribute to it as well. And then, I think we can get into the fact that, there may be, some genetic factors that have contributed to someone's experience of depression, or that there are, if you're familiar with the adolescent childhood adversity scale, the ACEs study, those factors contribute, to isolation and depression as well.
What is going on when somebody gets to that point? What does suicide mean to somebody who is contemplating suicide? Could anyone should just jump in. What does that mean?
I mean, I can share because I want to build a little bit on what John just said about the social environment and context. I hear a lot of people be dismissive of young people that, oh, this generation doesn't have resilience. That's why they have all these problems. But the world's really, really different now, even outside of COVID. I mean, the ways in which teenagers are expected to be basically professionals, right? There's a lot of times you can't do things for fun. It's way harder to get into college. There's all these pressures. High school athletes are like professional athletes now. It's just a whole other level of pressure. You're thinking about like climate change, the political climate that they're growing up in, and I think, and for other young people, exposure to community violence, gun violence that we're seeing in a lot of cities. But I think what the overwhelming theme I hear from other suicide attempt survivors is really a sense of despair or hopelessness, like things will not get better, or the amount of pain that I'm experiencing has outweighed like so much more than what I feel like I'm able to handle, that this feels like my only way out. And I think when you add on all the pressures of adolescence with the social and societal changes we're seeing, I think it makes a little more sense because you can't really escape social media. We couldn't escape the pandemic. There's all the societal pressure. So I think it's really isolation and lack of hope for the future.
So I have a question for you all. To what extent, I know they're interrelated, to what extent is this the fact that we all live in a chemical soup in our brains, right? We are all affected by what's going on, and trauma, of course, affects that chemical soup, and it could bring us to a dark place. To what extent is this chemically induced, and to what extent is this environmentally sort of this feeling of despair, no way out, and so on? And the story that I have to tell you all is that I was prescribed a couple of medications for various things, and those medications interacted really poorly, and I went into a really dark place, and I was like, whoa, I've got to deal with this. Went back to my doctor and eliminated, I actually ended up eliminating both medications, and it was like switching a light switch. Now that was a chemically induced condition, but there are, those kinds of things are, John, you had mentioned, some of this might be biological, some of it, and if it is biological, and if it is also something where the stresses are affecting our body chemistry, then there may be some ways in which we can shift, right? We might actually have the ability to control what's going on if we have the techniques to do that.
Control is a pretty interesting word, I think in the world of mental health, and I think everybody hopes to find that in some way. But I think, I guess, in my own experiences in working with people and my own struggles as a human being, I feel like balance is more the word, that I aim for in finding resources to allow someone to feel balanced in a sense of wholeness. Because oftentimes, when we experience something distressing, it can create a level of distress within us where we're fighting against ourselves, and we take on this identity as someone with a problem, and that internal struggle, it raises the stress level, and it increases things like cortisol, the stress hormone, and the way that can affect someone. And some of the things that, when it comes down to the idea of chemical imbalances, I think some of the recent research has really challenged some of the ideas around this idea that there is a chemical imbalance. That they haven't been able to support that, although that's kind of common, within our language in society, that, oh yeah, I'm dealing with a chemical imbalance. It's more complicated than that. Not to say that there aren't chemicals, and that when we add substances into our body, that those don't interact with things that are already present. But it's a bigger issue. It doesn't have a convenient explanation, I think.
So sometimes you have to let go. Sometimes you just have to create some sort of an equilibrium within yourself. René, are you seeing it the same way? Is there, as you approach young people, how do you counsel them? Because everybody's coming from a different place, right? Everybody has a different set of issues. There can't just be one prescription. How do you go about actually helping people who you don't know and who might be coming in to this issue from all these different possible directions?
Absolutely. Like you mentioned, it's not only about letting go, but working with the issues. And then again, you need to know the person. You need to get to know them, do a proper assessment to find out what are the different things that might be affecting them, and establish that rapport and that relationship where somebody can get to trust you in regards to dealing with these things. But definitely it's something like you mentioned, you use the word techniques, and also that's something that's basically therapy for us. When you're doing therapy, you need to change that mindset. You need to work those things within yourself so that you're able to see the world and see yourself in a more positive and different way, so that you're able to face all of the different things that we mentioned that are happening in the world, and probably a lot of trauma and history of difficult things that the person has dealt with.
And therapy isn't just one thing, right? I mean, it's not just talking. It could be exercise, it could be diet, it could be just being with friends, it could be relaxing. Kelly, could you just keep going on with the list? What do you understand in terms of the kinds of treatments that can be available, and what's the role of family and friends in all this?
Yeah, I mean, even when you talk about therapy, there's a lot of different modalities of therapy as well. I think that's actually what I was going to say, as somebody who works primarily in the world of peer support and not clinical services, is the ability to have someone sit there and listen to you and validate what you're experiencing is so important and healing when it comes to a topic that people feel like they can't say out loud at all. I think as family members or people who love someone and care about someone who's talking about suicide or any struggle, right, the instinct is to want to fix it. And that's a really good way to cause someone who shared that with you to shut down. So I think for us to say, you're not here to fix anyone, but you're here to listen and create a safe space and then work with them to see what they might want. That could be just sitting with someone in silence, like helping them get groceries, like all of these like really basic human connection things. Whereas a family member or a friend, it's not your responsibility to save someone or do anything like that. It's really about human connection and making someone feel valued and supporting them in just knowing someone's there and there's someone who they can talk to who won't judge them.
Is suicide my fault if somebody in my life commits suicide? How do I think about that?
No, absolutely not your fault or anybody's fault. I lost my best friend, to suicide and maybe 15 years ago. And, those were thoughts that I wrestled with personally, and what are the contributing factors that I added, just as we'd missed the warning signs. Like we weren't informed. And, looking back on it, there were plenty of warning signs, but we didn't know it. And I can say that, over time, as I've thought about it, the thing that is for certain for me is that my friend was suffering from an illness, and it was an illness, that took him. And I don't think he's to blame, and I don't think others are to blame. I think that it's the reality of an illness. Not to say that people can't be contributing factors to the distress of others, but when it comes down to who are the people who are still here after someone is gone, I don't think that they deserve blame.
René, how do you see that question?
Definitely, I see the same way. It's not your fault, but definitely I feel like we always ask ourselves, could we have done? Could we have done more? And unfortunately, like John mentioned, these are learning experiences. When this happens to you, you learn to be more open to other people, to be aware of different signs that they might be perceiving or sending our way, so that we're able to then prevent these things from happening with other people.
If I can just add on to that, I think there's the processing. Is there something I could have done differently? But I think part of that extends to how people feel like other people, what they'll think about them if they share that a family member or someone close to them attempted or died by suicide. I was at a fundraiser last night, and a woman said it took 6 months for her to even say to one other person that her daughter died by suicide, because she really blamed herself, and she didn't. She felt that other people would blame her as well, because a lot of these misguided beliefs or even assumptions about how other people will feel and respond. And sometimes they do respond that way. And I think it's valid for people to be concerned, and part of why we need real social change around these conversations.
Yeah, I'm not for myself. I'm not sure that I've ever found an answer to that question. I think that you sort of carry a view that there was perhaps more that could have been done had one been aware, more aware, had I been more aware, and people around me had been more aware. But I don't know that there's an easy answer that works for everyone. You're just trying to grapple, and John, I think your point about sort of learning, right? Learning and then taking someone's life and placing it into your heart and your experience and being informed by their lives is the best one can do, but it's an imperfect process. In terms of treating people and interacting with others, we were talking a little bit before the show started about the fact that it used to be that everything had to happen in person, and then we had telephones that we could talk, and we could write letters, and then later on, we're now at the point where we can look face to face. We have all of our little devices and so on. Has that influenced how the tool sets that you use in helping people navigate?
I definitely think that has been one of the benefits from COVID-19, that it has opened up remote services for us here in Western Mass. We're doing a lot of therapy, be it via phone, via video. I know there's also a lot of apps that are addressing mental health issues. So there's a lot of technology and new ways to find help.
John, Kelly, is technology a good or a bad thing? We hear about some of the ways that technology can also harm people's mental health. Would you like to comment?
Well, I think it's tough to say it's either good or bad when it comes down to technology. But Similar to René, one of the things that we've been able to do is reach more people, via telehealth here in New York City. Interestingly, though, some of the barriers that we've run into in working with young people and their families, providing clinical services via telehealth, is that we have to make sure that they understand we're not entertainers, that we're not one more box on the screen, and that this should be treated with some special regard. And we've had to provide families with education about that, and stress the importance that we're not just something that you can kind of act as a babysitter and put over here, turn us off really quickly. So those are some of the things that we've we're always trying to find our best practices, for what telehealth means, and I think that's the ongoing question for us.
We just completed two polls. One, we found that half the people know somebody or have been personally affected by suicide and suicidal ideation. The other is, we asked about whether there are sufficient resources, and it was interesting that 100% of the people who responded felt that there are insufficient resources to help young people in particular navigate. Is it a matter of insufficient money being spent, or is it a matter of insufficient awareness in society that allows for early intervention? Kelly, what do you think? Is this a dollars and cents issue? Is it an awareness issue, or is it somewhat of a both?
Well, first I wanted to go back to First, I wanted to go back to just the previous conversation, because I think that there's a really important distinction in adults and young people where online is just part of their world. It's not necessarily a big distinction, right? Having grown up, with an iPad, it's just very different. I think for us, one of the big things that we've seen, so we in the Mental Health America's national office do not do direct service, but we provide, one of our largest programs is an online mental health screening program. Over 16 million people have come and taken these depression, anxiety, looking for resources. About 2/3 are under 24. So it's a lot of young people who are really not doing well. And their biggest interests were things that they can do on their own, learning more information, and getting connected to peers versus just immediately going to clinical services. So I think it's really important to note that the way that young people navigate the world now is just different. I think one of the other important pieces that came up.
So it's a focus on community is what you're saying. It's really about peers and community more than going to a medical professional or somebody who is older or somebody who is has a particular expertise. It's like, no, wait a second. You know who has the expertise? People like me.
I think it's definitely both. And I think that's part of when we're prioritizing where to invest, right? So there's a massive mental health provider shortage, especially for young people, especially if you're talking about psychiatrists. But then there's also been a really historic lack of investment in young people themselves and how they can support one another. One of the evidence-based approaches to reducing suicide in schools is training young people directly about mental health education and suicide prevention. There's a lot more effort, especially with a lot of the funding that's gone to states in the past couple of years, to really build out those programs. So yes, there's not enough, but I think it's about thinking about more comprehensively. One of the examples I use, right, is like if you, and part of this is my lived experience, right? After a suicide attempt, you could go to the hospital, you can get connected to the providers, they can be as good as they can be, and then you can go back to school and people make fun of you for trying to kill yourself, right? So it's like, how do you, or you exist in your community every other hour outside of the hour you're in those offices that week. So I think working with young people and empowering young people, you just have to do that to change culture. And young people are really interested in learning about this stuff too.
Are there hot points in society where, if we were going to create a heat map of people living in particular circumstances, rural versus urban versus suburban, people of certain ages, we've already identified that people in high school and going into college are, that age group is very vulnerable. We have poverty, we have identity, issues of orientation, issues of race, issues. My goodness, is there a heat map that we can look at, René, to give us a sense of where resources in this country ought to be focused, because people living in that particular set of circumstances are particularly vulnerable, so that we can do a little bit more preventive, be a little bit more preventive in terms of how we think about investing in these resources?
I mean, there's definitely heat maps, and especially like you mentioned, there are so many things that are going on. We have an opioid epidemic, we have racial issues, we have so many things that we need to see how we're going to invest in those services. But then again, I think that a lot of times the service providers are undervalued and they're not compensated properly. And I think that's one of the main issues, because like Kelly mentioned, there's a big difference in providing services to adults and to youth. Providing services to the youth, it's way more involved. You need to collaborate with schools, with teachers, Department of Children and Families, with the parents themselves. And it takes more to develop those relationships and provide that treatment. And I feel like a lot of times they're not equally compensated when it comes to that, because it's way harder to provide it. And unfortunately, I've seen it here historically, how more and more service providers stop providing services for children because of the difficulty, and they just continue seeing adults. So I feel that should be very concerning.
I'd like to end up, and I'd like everybody to comment on this with a question to you all. Over half of suicides occur through firearms. I don't want to get into a discussion of Second Amendment rights and so on. I think that those are discussions that there are valid points to be made on all sides. But the means of quickly going from thought to execution is really stunning. And if you take a look at how many people die through firearm suicide every year, how do we deal with that?
Yeah, I mean, I can speak quickly to that. I think there's this misguided belief that people have that if somebody wants to kill themselves, they'll just find any way to do it. But there's a lot of evidence to support that eliminating access to lethal means really does reduce suicide. So for young people, right, obviously, people under 21, people who are under 18, if you own a firearm, making sure that that young person does not have access to it or cannot access it is really important. And then we as an organization, it's a very contentious issue in the US, but have worked with there's a lot of work in rural parts of the country in working with the folks who actually sell guns to help identify signs of risk or prepare people who are purchasing firearms about the potential risks and issues of suicide in their community. So I think that there's the means reduction is really, really, really important if you're worried about someone. And then there's ways to, same with social media, this is what it is right now. Like, this is where we are with guns in this country. How do we reduce harm when it comes to people dying by suicide?
René, John, do you have any? John?
Yeah, Kelly's point was excellent. Just gun locks, gun safes, things that prevent access, I think is really the key there.
Definitely better regulations. I mean, if we're not going to decrease the number of firearms that we have in this country, then definitely preventing access to people who might be vulnerable and might end up hurting themselves is something that we need to focus on.
Yeah, I think that, and just sort of being aware that there are people you can call. There's the 988 hotline. So I want everybody to just be aware that exists, that there is help out there. Can you all just share with us how people can get in touch with your organizations, John, René, and then we'll end up with Kelly?
Well, my organization, fortunately, we're the administrators of the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. And so, if someone's in great need, I would suggest utilizing 988 for suicide prevention and also mental health crisis in general. Don't
wait, in other words.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And And our organization's website is vibrant.org. And one other thing that we found really helpful with high school students is our information on Be the One To, and Be the One to Help, which has a 5-step protocol on how to talk to someone if they seem like they might be suicidal. So I recommend checking that out.
Thanks so much, John. Renee?
A particular organization, MHA, can be accessed through mhainc.org or 1-844-MHA-HELP. But I know that the state also has a lot of directories for either support groups, treatments. So they can easily be accessed. We just need to provide the resources for more treatment providers to be available.
And Kelly?
Yeah, so I would say it's a bit twofold. We have affiliates across the country, but we do a lot of policy work. So if you're interested in getting involved in some of the laws and regulations and funding that we mentioned, mhanational.org, we have a lot of information. You can get involved from a policy advocacy side. But then if you're looking for help for yourself or a loved one, or just to share how people can learn more about mental health, they can go to mhascreening.org for the clinically validated mental health screens and a lot of information about a lot of concerns that especially young people are facing.
And there's no shame, because when you're in a crowd, when you're walking along the way, when you are sitting in a ballpark watching a game or going to a concert, if you just reach out within your arm's length, there is somebody here who has experience with suicidal ideation. We're all part of this family. We all have these struggles to contend with. So let's share and let's reach out for help. Kelly Davis, Vice President of Youth and Peer Advocacy of Mental Health America. René Piñero, Vice President of Behavioral Health and Clinical Operations of the Mental Health Association of Massachusetts, and John Orr, Vice President of Programs of Vibrant Emotional Health in New York. Thank you so much for sharing your experiences with us. Please thank your staffs. Please thank your volunteers, and there are a lot of them. Please thank your funders. We really appreciate your help in understanding and navigating this very complex situation.